last year when Russia annexed Crimea. And there was so much enthusiasm and hope in regard to the UN from Ukrainian side. You know, Security Council meetings were broadcasted live and millions of people were watching here in Ukraine, and it was something unprecedented. But 15 months later, there is a broad frustration in Ukraine and abroad the way UN handled the Ukrainian crisis. Are you frustrated too with the inability of the United Nations to protect its founding member in the face of abuse and assault on its territorial integrity?
I'm extremely frustrated, above all, with Russia and Russian aggression. So I think it's important to start there. And the UN system, it's no secret, is vulnerable when a founding permanent member of the Security Council with a veto decides that it's going to toss the UN Charter out the window and try to take over territory belonging to its neighbor. That creates problems for the organization because we, 5 countries who are so privileged as to have the veto and to have been given it because of our roles in World War II and our commitments to maintain international peace and security, for us to abuse that privilege really is a disgrace. And that is what Russia has done, you know, most immediately on Ukraine, but also on Syria, where it's cast 4 vetoes in order to defend a government that's using chemical weapons against its own people. So the vulnerability of the UN Security Council and its relative impotence when a permanent member like Russia decides its own interests require ignoring central tenets of the international order has been exposed, you know, for all to see. I do think, though, that it's important for Ukrainians to know that what we do at the UN still matters, even though it's true we can't get Russia to sanction itself or to condemn itself. That's probably not going to happen, since even in Russia proper, journalists are locked up who criticize the government. So it's unlikely that Russia is going to allow, through the UN Security Council, the kind of measures that we would like to see. That goes without saying. But in the UN General Assembly, we secured, working with our Ukrainian friends, an overwhelming vote on behalf of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, one that has not reversed Russian aggression yet in Crimea or in eastern Ukraine, but one that ensures that the maps at the United Nations will never change, that the borders will remain exactly as they should, exactly as they are. And so some of what we're doing there is still making a difference, but I think one of the reasons Ukrainians are probably over the UN Security Council and particularly frustrated is they, like I, have to hear this nonsense where up is down and black is white and you know, what I call upside down land. That's extremely hard to watch over and over again. So it doesn't surprise me that they might prefer to watch music videos or sports instead.
One of the most important things that UN does in this conflict in Ukraine is humanitarian aid. And this is one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, with millions of people affected. And especially in eastern Ukraine, with at least 2 million displaced. But even following the UN calculations, Ukraine has received only 20% of requested international aid. Why do you think that this still is not a global priority, and why it's so hard to get a requested amount? Because it's not that it's so expensive either.
It's a very fair question. I'd say a couple of things. First, my overwhelming impression, having been only here in Ukraine for a day so far, is that the Ukrainian people have stepped up remarkably and from a global perspective, very unusually, in terms of individual and family generosity toward those who've been displaced and those less fortunate and more vulnerable. We went to a center or a building that was housing internally displaced families, and just some businessman who opened up his premises and turned it into a dorm room and the gratitude of these families who've lost everything because of Russian shelling and aggression toward a man they'd never met before, and I just get the sense that that's happening across the country. And so I think what's extremely important and kind of has happened to the amazement of the world is how much Ukrainians have themselves shouldered the responsibility to deal with the humanitarian burden. In terms of the appeal, though, which of course should be fully funded, I think Ukraine is suffering because of the number of humanitarian crises that are happening around the world. Because in Syria, more than 10 million people have been displaced, 10 million. Because in Iraq, ISIL is still making inroads, and Iraqi civilians are getting displaced, tens of thousands even each day probably as we sit here. And Boko Haram in Nigeria, just the Gaza crisis and the aftermath of that. There are just so many challenges right now around the world that every dollar is being spread across multiple crises. I mean, there was a time, had this happened, even 10 years ago, I guarantee that appeal would be 100% met because you had more resources to deal with fewer challenges. And so it's a really tough time for Ukrainians, and it's rendered tougher by the fact that the world is sort of spread a little more thin across a lot of crises.
My last question will be to take a broader picture. When we look at the Ukrainian crisis, the crisis in Syria or in Libya, how do you assure and how do you protect human rights when we have to deal with the increasing power of the world of realpolitik?
Well, I think the world of realpolitik and the world of human rights should go together, because the truth is when human rights are abused, people get alienated, they may be inclined to be radicalized. When human rights are respected, governments are held accountable, corrupt leaders are thrown out, government performance increases. When government performance increases, more business comes in. So I think it's leaders who have an interest in repressing opposition and leaders who don't want to hear criticism that have an interest in perpetuating the idea that somehow realism is on one side and human rights are on the other. If you're realistic about what will bring stability and prosperity to your country, it's not carrying out aggression, not perpetuating conflict, letting journalists hold you accountable even if it's painful to hear sometimes. I know firsthand it can be painful. But the kind of the commitments in the UN Charter to human rights and fundamental freedoms and to peace and security, it's a commitment to those values that is realistic and that will bring about rewards to the head as well as the heart.